used for the word love, and it's a chava. And I want you to say it with me, but before you do, you got to get your Hebrew on. Are you ready? Here's how you speak Hebrew. All you got to do. Ready? Let's hear it. Don't spit on people. Achava. Say it. Achava. All the way in the back. Achava. Achava is a Hebrew word for love. It's made up of 4 basic Hebrew letters. It's actually translated to us, I love or I give. If I was going to say to you, sir, as awkward as this is in our point, our relationship, that I love you, I would say achava to you. If I was going to say, I'm going to give you this, I would say achava to you. It's the same word. Because to understand love, God's love, you got to understand giving. Because real love costs, and there was a transaction that was paid for you. John 3:16, God so what? The world that he what? He loved, so he gave. Because to love is to give, and to give is to love. And if you want to understand God's love, the shamim of it all, it's going to involve a transaction. It's going to involve us paying something. Jesus paid his life to display what love is. 1 John 3:16, if you don't have a Bible, that's okay. Stay at a hotel. There's one in the drawer. That's where I got this one. I think it's the only place where theft is probably encouraged. 1 John 3:16, we know what love is by this. I could tell you metaphor after metaphor and illustration after illustration about what God's love is like, but my favorite is just simply a red umbrella. You see, in the Old Testament, it was the blood of a lamb that you put on the doorposts of a house. In the New Testament, John says, behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. In the Old Testament was a lamb. In the New Testament, it is Jesus, the Lamb. In the Old Testament, it was a house. In the New Testament, the first letter of Corinthians says, you are the house, you are the temple that the blood is applied to. And it becomes a covering, an umbrella, a protection. Doesn't make things easy, but faith makes things possible. And death may have been knocking at your door, but in Jesus, you got a covering. You got a love covering. Somebody say love. Every single follower of Christ should be an umbrella, should be a covering for this reason. It's one thing to say it to you, it's a whole other thing to experience it. It's one thing for me to articulate it in mere words that fall short in my humanity and frailty, and it's another thing to experience it firsthand in your life. I can remember in the Philippines, across the street from what is known as the City of Death, the pastor of the local church that's there, this covering, says to me, if we go over there and the thief would hold a gun at you or corner you, just simply say the word alliance. Of course, I'm in the back. That's all I heard was gun and hurt you. I'm like, what is alliance? Is that like Tagalog where I come in peace, or what do you? So I asked, what's alliance? He said, no, Eric, it's much simpler than that. It's not something that's confusing. It's just the name of our church. That's church success, church. Can you walk into the hardest parts of your city, and by the covering that your church has been, how you've loved those people, the protection that your church has been for them, can they say that a thief would draw the weapon just because of the name of your church? That's church success. Somebody say love. I experienced that umbrella firsthand, to see the covering, the difference between people that had a covering and the people that did not. In fact, those same kids, a year later, there was a massive tsunami in the Philippines that wiped out thousands of people, and not one of these children from that church or any of the other churches that have a covering, that have a protection, died in that natural disaster. I think that deserves a round of applause. Because they had a covering, because they had a shelter. Every single follower of Christ should be an umbrella for this reason. I want to tell you that the church, that was a compassion church. The children that didn't die in that storm, they were compassion kids. They had a sponsor like you. They had a covering, because love changes everything. Every follower of Christ should be a covering to this earth, because love changes everything. I remember it was not my turn to speak. I was at a festival in Pennsylvania. I was eating a funnel cake. And this guy gets up front, he starts talking about the world. And I stopped listening altogether. You know that 30,000 children will die today in a hospital bed, or their mother's arms, or a ditch, because they can't do what we do. Wake up in the middle of the night, open up the refrigerator, look inside and go, there's nothing to eat. I've done that. They can't eat, they're hungry, so they die. 25,000 children to 30,000 kids die because hunger has taken their life. They don't have a covering. They don't have an umbrella. Every 15 seconds to click to the clock, you can read about it. People die, kids die, because they can't get what I painted with. They can't get water. Time you listen to a song that starts and begins or ends in a district full of red lights, 12 sons and daughters are sold. It breaks my heart and breaks God's. And every follower of Christ should be a covering, because love changes everything. He starts talking about all this stuff, and I stopped listening altogether, because he starts talking about Compassion International. Now, I didn't know all these things that I know about Compassion then as I do now. 83 to 86% of every dollar actually goes to the child. They work through the local church. It's not a bunch of guys riding in on choppers saying good luck with life. They empower a church to reach their community. I didn't know all that. All I knew is that I didn't think it was real, but something in my heart was tugging for me to be a covering, for me to be umbrella. So I sponsored a little girl. Here she is. I looked at this packet and I filled it out on the back. I put it on my debit card because it had to come out, and I didn't have the $38 that it costs. I had to, get real sacrificial here. I had to shut down my cable TV from 400 channels down to 100 channels. There was still nothing on. My wife and I sponsored our first little girl. Filled out the form and turned it in. I wrote a letter, because inside of every one of these kids, and by the way, this is a piece of treasure right here. This is not just some random child. This is the only one right here. I filled out the form and turned it in and wrote a letter and got a letter back. I still didn't believe it. I still didn't think it was real. So I got on a plane from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I'm from, and I flew to Managua, Nicaragua, and the pastor of the local church picked me up and took me to her house. Knocked on the door that looked like a laundry basket sort of flipped upside down. I'll never forget this moment. It swung open, and the mother stood there and looked at me and looked at my wife, and she said, "Enrico, Daniela, you've come. I'm thousands of miles from home, and I show up to this woman's doorstep unannounced, and she knows me by name from the letters that I'd written her daughter." I looked past her hair, kind of the corner of her neck. Just past the mother stood these eyes, connected to this little girl named Crystal that once was a packet just like this. She jolted me out of that moment, and she looked at me and she said, "Eric, I'll never forget it." She said, "Thank you for being Jesus to my family."